Alrighty, I remembered some other things about my granddad that I'm going to tell you. He was in the war, as I mentioned. He started out. Well, we got this. The reason I know this is because I can't remember who it was. Somebody in the family wrangled him down and basically wrangled him down and told him that he had to tell us about the war because he never talked about it. Not to me anyway. The only time I remembered him saying anything was when he was out pushing his silage with his tractor that had tracks on it, like a big bulldozer, half-ton bulldozer. Well, I don't know. It was a bulldozer. And it had a blade on the front and it had tracks like a tank. And he was a tank commander, and he said he liked that bulldozer because it reminded him of the tank. That's the only time I'd really heard of him talk about the war. Outside of this time, everybody basically said, you're going to tell us about all this stuff and we're going to get it on camera. And this is back when cameras were new, well, VHS cameras were new. We're not talking about forever ago when, like, the invention of the camera. We're not talking about that. Not that old. Anyway, the VHS camcorder was fairly new, and so we were at the Huff's house. They were my cousins, and Grandpa told us about jumping on the railroad and leaving home and going to California, and basically like hitchhiking on the railroad. And you know, stowing away in the boxcars. And then he didn't much care for that, ended up washing dishes and not making any money, and so he came home. But then when he got in the war, I remember him telling us about how he knew about horses. And so he ended up taking care of one of the general's horses. I can't remember which general he told me. I should know that. Might have been Patton for all I know, but that would be cool. But he ended up taking care of the colonel or the general, some high official's horses. And then from there, ended up moving into where he was doing tanks. And when he was in the tanks, up getting shot out of one of them, like one of the shells. He was up above looking through the binoculars, and a shell came through from the enemy Panzer and bounced around in his tank and killed his crew and took a big chunk out of his leg. And while he was recovering, they took him and the Sherman tank back, and he knew the guy that was working on the tank, and he told the guy who was the mechanic to mount a machine gun on top of it so he could lift his hand up and swivel the machine gun around. He said that the infantrymen would come in and they couldn't really do much about it with the Shermans because they only had machine guns in the front. So he ended up telling him to do that. Now he said after that everybody wanted to be in his platoon, or whatever they call tanks, squadron or platoon or whatever they call tanks that are all together. And because he would, you know, the infantryman would show up and he'd stick his arm out of the hatch and just you know, go around in a 360 swivel and make sure that nobody was going to mess with his platoon, squad, pod. I'm not sure what they call tanks, but gaggle. But he ended up, like I said, he didn't talk much about that, but he was in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. And I don't remember him ever saying anything else about it. That's the only time I remember him talking about stuff like that. And I only heard it once, and it stuck with me forever. I mean, I heard that when I was probably 11, 12 years old. Maybe a little, maybe 14, because I think it was before we moved to Tennessee. And I remember that story, I mean, like it was yesterday, sitting in the Huff's room, but the Huff's living room. But he was a good man. I loved my Grandpa Ralph. forward to seeing him again. But he was always laughing and smiling, as I mentioned, and lots of times he'd have me get down and he needed something done, and I'd be up there in the tractor with him in the cab. One of my favorite times in the cab was I learned about the radio, and I had to listen to the modern stuff, right? And so I'm with Grandpa and we're cutting hay or doing maybe something with the corn, I don't know. We're in this big case tractor and it has a radio in it. It was one of the news tractors. It was so cool to get up in there because it had air conditioning and it's brand new, and it had a FM, AM radio. Back then, FM was new, at least then on the tractor. And so we got to listen to my radio station, Grandpa. So I turn it on, and he would sing along just as loud as he could. Didn't know the single word to any song, but he would sing and sing. And I'd just laugh and tell him he sounded funny, and he'd just laugh some more. Every time I'm mowing the grass on my ride-on tractor, I think of my Grandpa Ralph. It's like the closest thing I have to a tractor. And I always, when I'm cutting the grass, I'm like, okay, what would he do? Would he go around? Because he had this system that he could go down one furrow and come back another one, and and not go right next door. But he had this system that he never missed. He never, where he would always hit the furrows, every single one of them, without going any extra. I always thought that was fascinating. But he had some farm hands. Bill, I remember his name, Bill. But he'd fix anything on that farm, and Grandpa always loved him, said he was his right hand. He also had some other workers that I never did like too much. Some of them tried to give me tobacco when I was, like chewing tobacco when I was a kid. Like little tiny kid, like 6 years old or something. Maybe 11, but tiny kid. They tried to give me chewing tobacco, telling me that it was gum. Teenagers, but waving at the other motorists. Oh, this one has a camera, so we got to stop here. But anyway, what else did Grandpa Ralph do? He was always, I told you he was a terrible driver. We'd always go to the parade at his hometown, and he had a little small town that he was from, and everybody knew Ralph. We'd always there, seemed like for... No, I remember going to watch Benji with him. Benji was a dog, and there was a movie about Benji the Dog, and I went and watched the movie with him, and they had popcorn, and I just kept eating the popcorn, but I kept complaining about it, saying, oh, this tastes terrible, but I kept eating it, and he made fun of me for days for that one. Oh, this popcorn tastes terrible. I'm going to keep eating it. And he'd always say, I'm going to get some groceries. So up there on the screen, Benji'd go, he had to go get some food, and Grandpa, loud as he could be, going to get some groceries in the middle of the theater, he was always, if you worried about you wanted to be embarrassed, you'd hung around Grandpa Ralph, but after a while you realized that it was more fun to be around him and be embarrassed than it was to not be around him. Because he was loud. We'd be at church or in real secret, like real sacred parts of the church, and he's just loud as he could be. What else did Grandpa Ralph do? I always had that. Oh, this is one thing that they had a lot of money from what I understand, but they never acted like they had money. He could have gone out and bought him a brand new truck every year probably and not have been hurting at all. And but yet he always drove that little Ford Ranger to go inseminate the cows. And he always had that old Goldie truck, two-wheel drive. And that's the other thing. I never understood why he always had two-wheel drive trucks. He's on a farm, so you're driving around in the mud. And when I was 14 and 15 on that farm, I'd get those two-wheel drive trucks stuck in all kinds of mud. sometimes I got stuck in a puddle, you know, and he always had bald tires. I was like, never understood that. I figured he had plenty of money, but boy, he would never go buy anything unless he absolutely had to. At least that's the way I saw it. But I got his truck stuck. I never flipped any tractors or anything. Actually, he hardly ever let me drive the tractors. I wanted to drive the tractors. When I found out that my cousins were driving tractors when they were younger than me, I was ticked. But you know, I had to break him in. Every time that I saw him, I was the oldest, and I'd want to do this or I'd want to do that. That reminds me, one time I came down and I was probably 11, 12 years old, and I wanted to ride the horse. And he was busy doing something, and he said, well, if you can go saddle her up, you can ride her. And later on, I found out he was thinking, there's no way this city kid's going to be able to get a bridle and saddle on that horse. And so he didn't think he'd have to let me ride the horse. But I went down and I found the bridle, and I found her bit, and I found her reins, and I found everything I needed, but I was too little to lift the saddle. Ooh, water. And but I got her to take the bit, got her to, you know, got the reins on there, and I just hopped up and barebacked her and found it, you know, rode up to where my grandpa was, and he about fell over dead, he said, because he didn't think that there was any way I was going to be able to do that. So I just rode her bareback. Woo! But there were lots of times he didn't think I could do stuff I could do. I guess I'd watch him intently every time he was showing me stuff. But he'd still yell and scream at me anytime I messed up, that's for sure. I'm back.